Lovely. Hello, everybody, and my name's Zoe Reed. I'm the chair of SACU, the Society for Anglo-Chinese Understanding, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to what I know is going to be a conversation I've been really keen to hear. It will be between Dr. Francis Wood, who's an eminent sinologist and historian, and we're proud to say is the SACU Vice President, and Michael Crook, whose mother, who's now I think 104, was born in China and brought Michael and his brothers up there, and to hear their life story. Now I've met Michael on several occasions, but never really had the opportunity to really hear all about it. So that's going to be really exciting. Michael will explain, I'm sure, his current roles, but I know that he's SACU member, leads the Beijing branch, but he's probably more importantly the chair of the ICCIC. I'm sure he'll explain and talk about that. So this is a conversation between Dr. Francis Wood and Michael Crook, and we'll hear all about his experiences and that of his family. There'll probably be maybe 10 minutes at the end. If anybody has any burning questions, do pop them into the Q&A function. This is a webinar, so I'm afraid we can't see you, but you can see us. And you can't speak to us, but we can speak to you. So I hope that's okay. I think I'm just going to dip out now and hand over to Francis. Francis.
Thank you. Well, it's a very great pleasure for me to be able to talk to Michael at some distance. He might perhaps explain where he is and why he is. But above all, really, we want to hear from him the extraordinary story of his family's life, going back to about 100 years of contact with China, close contact with China, and in the context of understanding China from the UK, he's really a pivotal person. So, Michael, can you explain where you are and what we're doing?
Well, first of all, at this very moment, I'm in an airport in Shanghai because this afternoon I was attending a meeting of Gung Ho. Zoe mentioned ICCIC, that is the International Committee for the Promotion of Chinese Industrial Cooperatives. And this is a venerable institution that was founded in the 1930s. And the first chairman was a Brit and an Englishman called Bishop Ronald Hall of Hong Kong. So I feel very honored to be his successor. So this organization has actually been, many Brits have served in this organization, and it's been contributed to China's war effort when it was undergoing aggression from Japan and so on. And it continued, and the name ICCIC Industrial Cooperatives is the operative word. And what we do now is we try and help, China has tremendous record lifting rural population out of poverty. One of the important instruments is farmers' cooperatives, and we do training and support for cooperatives. But maybe I should, if Francis' question was not about this very minute, we were attending a Gung Ho meeting in Shanghai. I'll go back to my own, where I am in history. She mentioned our fact. Well, first of all, I'm British because my father, I'm British by birth, but I was born in China. Dad was born in 1910 of a middle-class Jewish family, and he became politicized during the Depression. I think there were a lot of people, and especially the rise of fascism led many people to become politicized. So my dad went to fight in the international brigades in Spain in 1936, and he was wounded in the Battle of Jarama. And while recovering from his wound in a hospital in Madrid, where he met Dr. Bethune. Some of you may have heard of the Dr. Bethune, who came to China in 1938. And one of the hot off the press was a book published in Britain in 1937 called Red Star Over China. And it was doing the rounds in the wards and among the staff as well as the patients and so on. And Dad read it and was really excited to read about things like the Long March and whatnot. So after Spain, he decided to come to China, and he arrived in 1938. He was in Shanghai. I was actually telling about his his adventures in Shanghai in 38. The Japanese had occupied China, and there were all kinds of atrocities, and I think it engendered a lot of sympathy. People like George Hogg, I don't know if you've heard of him. Anyway, there were lots of people. The China Campaign Committee, which Jenny Clegg's father, Arthur Clegg, was really a prime mover there. There was a lot of sympathy engendered, and and I should mention the Friends Ambulance units. A lot of Quakers came out, non-combatants, but they also came to China. I think over 100 came to Britain in the 30s. It came to China in the 30s. So anyway, Dad was one of that cohort. And the thing is that after 2 years in Shanghai, teaching also at St. John's University, a mission university, he met some underground communists who were posing as Christians, but he became, he was very impressed with what they were doing, and he decided to stay in China, and he went west and met my mother in Sichuan. Now, Mother was born in 1915, so this year she's not to 104, but she'll be turning 106 actually. And she is in Beijing, and I'll be, so after this webinar, I'll catch a plane and go back to Beijing, and it'll be rather late, but I'll be home. Anyway, so her parents were missionaries. They were in the Protestant missionaries. There was a thing, the social gospel was something that moved many people in North America and Britain. I think it started in Britain in the Victorian times. And the idea was that just preaching is not going to make you many converts. You have to do good. And the good was mostly setting up schools and hospitals. So Grandma and Grandpa both had a role in that. Grandma set up, I believe it was the first Montessori kindergarten in China, and then a primary school called the Dewey School, Chengdu Dewey School. Grandpa was the dean of the Department of Education in the West China Union University now these, I should say that in terms of friendship and understanding, when I was a child, that was the skeleton in the closet. I never told anyone that I had missionary grandparents, because in those days, many people in China felt, well, they came in on the coattails of the imperialists and they're just, stooges, and anyway, they had a very bad name. But now, over the last few decades, there is a new, much more balanced view of the foreign presence in China. And I think it's been a sort of a mission of mine, being British, born in China, to try and dig up the stories of the good Brits, not the ones who brought the opium over, or people who ran gunboats up and down China's inland rivers, that sort of thing. So, well, to come back to, Mum's story, so Grandma and Grandpa were in education. Mum trained as an anthropologist in Canada, and then she came back to China to work among, she took an interest in what they called the tribes people in those days, the minorities who lived in the mountain areas, some of the poorest parts of China. And so she came back from her training in Canada in 1939, and Dad came in 1938, and they met in 1940. My dad had become a communist, and there's a lot, the romantic side. I think the story of the Long March is really a very gripping tale, and my dad, it is said, engineered his proposal of marriage on Luding Bridge, the site of a very heroic event during the Long March. Anyway, so the two of them got married during the war. When the European War broke out, well, they decided to go to Britain. So Dad joined the RAF in 1942 and 3, I think, around then. Mum also joined the army. And one interesting thing is that, you know, when the Japanese invaded China, first in 1931 and then all-out war in 1937, the Western powers were not involved. You know, they continued to sell stuff to Japan and whatnot. But later, when Hitler invaded in Western Europe, and the Axis Pact meant that he was aligned with Japan, suddenly the Japanese War was part of the Second World War. So Mum and Dad joined up in England, and actually the British decided to support, because now that after Pearl Harbor especially, Britain and China became allies in the Second World War. And one wonderful thing that the British decided to do, I'm not sure whose idea it was, but they decided to help with a science project. And Dr. Joseph Needham, who actually founded, one of the key movers in founding SACU in 1965, it was picked to be sent to China in 1943. Before his departure, he decided that he asked around if there were any recent arrivals from China who could give him a bit of a briefing, and my dad was discovered. So they got together, and when Dad found that he was talking to a scientist, one thing he did was he claims that he told Dr. Needham, he said, oh, you know, China has a tremendous tradition in scientific and technological development going back thousands of years. Be sure when you go to take note of China's contributions to science, and which of course I think Dr. Needham would have done in any case, and of course we now have the multi-volume, you know, China science and technology tomes that he wrote. So that and actually that links up with gung ho, because Dr. Needham, when he came out, met up with people like the New Zealander Rui Ali, whom my grandma mistook him for an Englishman. There's a letter dated 1939 January, I think, saying, "Oh, we had a talk from an Englishman called Rui Ali, who told about the cooperatives trying to help the war effort." And then she crossed out the typing and wrote in by hand, New Zealander. So anyway, back to the story. After the war, my parents, I guess their fascination with China was very much alive. So when Dad was demobbed from the Royal Air Force, he got a sort of veterans grant type thing, and he decided to study Chinese at SOAS. And Mum decided to do a PhD at LSE. on rural conditions, because those were things they were really interested in. And then news came out in 1947 that the communists were going to launch a land reform campaign. And this really fascinated them, because I think they had both felt that the unequal, if the tiller doesn't have land, well, there it's misery. And so they got out with a veterans grant and a Scarborough Fellowship and came out to China in 47, thinking that they would observe and study the land reform, and which would also be my mum's doctoral dissertation, incidentally, for LSE. But when they finished it in 1948, they were invited to, because in 1948, the communists, the Civil War, they were on the verge of victory and expecting to set up what they call the New China, which happened in 1949, which would need foreign affairs workers, as they're called in China, diplomatic or business or people dealing with foreigners in general, and they needed language. So Mum and Dad were invited to teach English, which they agreed to do, I think, somewhat reluctantly, thinking maybe for a year or two. But my mum's still here. They just ended up settling in China, and which is how come my brothers and I we were all born in China, brought up in China. Mum was brought up by missionaries in a missionary community, and consequently English was her first language, and she only attended Canadian schools. And she thought that was a terrible mistake that should not be repeated among her own children. So Mum and Dad, who both spoke quite fluent Chinese, decided that they would just speak Chinese to us at home. So Chinese was my first language. I began my English age 6, but I think I've done reasonably well. But Chinese is certainly my first language. So Chinese kindergarten, primary school, middle school, and then 5 years working in factories and so on. You might wonder why the son of 2 professors would work in a factory for 5 years. Well, that was the Cultural Revolution, which started in the late 60s and lasted several years. Schools stopped, and it was fairly chaotic, but it was certainly a very, I mean, for life experience, it was incredible. The amount of travel that we did. I got to see the countryside, which I've been interested in ever since, which is why I have this gung-ho thing. Yeah, so, and then I went to England in the early 70s when the Cultural Revolution finished, and I went to university. I went to college in London. I went to Queen Mary College. I studied physics. I thought I would go into that. And, but then I just couldn't stay away, I guess. I came back to China and I taught physics, and I taught in the graduate school of the China University of Science and Technology for a while. And this was the time of the reform and opening. China was just changing so fast. The Cultural Revolution, well, that was one thing. But after the 70s, there was reform and opening, and planned economy turned into the sort of market economy, and state sector was denationalized to a big extent, and they got the market economy and a private sector and so on. It's really fascinating. So I've kept coming back. I've stayed now 50 of my 70 years in China and seen tremendous changes. And I'd like to say that there were many good Brits who helped China along. I mentioned the just now Friends Ambulance Unit during the war, but there were also education, there were schools, people came out to teach, and there were doctors. I don't know if you've heard of Dr. Joshua Horn, Joss Horn, quite a prominent surgeon, came out and helped to set up. He was oh dear, what is it? Bones man, whatever. I forget what the word is. Is that orthopedics? I don't know. Anyway, the hospital that he was involved in founding is now China's leading hospital in that sort of thing. You've got bone fractures and so on. And I think they did an incredible job in the 50s where they some worker had a hand chopped clean off and they joined it together, and the man was able to squeeze things and move the fingers individually and so on. Anyway, they did great. So an Englishman who helped China with surgery. There were scientists. Dorothy Hodgkin came out. There were writers. There were anyway. Well, here I'm just rabbiting on. Maybe Francis, you could steer me a bit.
Well, I was interested. What about the British people who were not so much visitors? I mean, obviously those are fantastically important,
Yes.
but the sort of core of British people, perhaps I mean, I suppose, of course, no, Hintons aren't British, are they? But I mean, should we be quite so separatist and talk about, the Brits?
Well,
I mean, it's foreigners as well who have come out to China to try and help.
I think that there were many organizations. Well, I've mentioned Gung Ho and the Friends Ambulance Unit. There were also friendship associations, and I mentioned Arthur Clegg and the China Campaign Committee, but also Britain-China Friendship Society, and of course SACU. That's us. But there were many individuals who just came out in all fields of endeavor. I think George Thompson came out in the 50s to study philosophy and read. There were many who, I guess, teachers, doctors, scientists. These made a great I could mention some unlikely ones. The Korean War, Britain sent troops to Korea, and China, of course, was on the other side. And there were prisoners taken, POWs. After the armistice, the American and British and so on prisoners of war were offered passage back home, but they were also given the option of staying behind if they chose. And actually, when I was a child, so I was born in 51, the war finished in the mid-50s, an Englishman called Andy Condren actually chose to stay in China and came and taught in the university and did some babysitting for mum and dad. So I remember him. Now, imagine that, eh? And the interesting thing is, so many of these people came out and became friends of China even after they went back. I think earlier, I should mention Keen helped Dr. Needham in the founding of SACU. He was in the diplomatic service in China in the 40s. Well, he was with Dr. Needham in the 30s, in the early 40s. When mum and dad came out to study land reform under the communists, China was still divided. The nationalists, who were the officially recognized government by most countries in the world, the Republic of China, had diplomatic relations. So Derek Bryan was a diplomat with the British, and that was the nationalist government. Mum and Dad were studying in the communist-controlled area, and of course it was civil war. So when they were sending stuff back, it was a bit dangerous because the nationalists tended to confiscate stuff coming out of communist areas. And actually, so Mum and Dad, who had met Derek, would get things to him, which would come out through the diplomatic pouch. And so, for example, my mum and dad, one of their books called Revolution in a Chinese Village 10 Mile In was published in Britain in 1959. So Derek, I mentioned that the first time I left China was when I was age 6. So I started learning English, went to Canada and then Britain. In London, we stayed in number 87 Holden Road, right next door to the Bryans, Derek and Hung Ying, such wonderful people, and became very good friends. I mentioned that I went to university in England in the mum and dad, their Chinese salary was not terribly high, converted into pounds at about 10 rand to the pound, didn't go very far. So I had to college mostly. And Derek very kindly offered me a job teaching Chinese at the Polytechnic of Central London, PCL. I was actually very shy in those days, and I couldn't. I thanked him very much, and I declined teaching at PCL. But I think he knew that I really needed it, and all it took was a sort of a goad. So one day he called me up and said, look, Michael, I know you don't want to teach, but we're desperate. One of the teachers is ill. The students have come. Could you just pop over and do a newspaper reading session or something? And so that was the launch of my teaching career. And I think a lot of that Polytechnic of Central London, actually, I don't know whether it made friends for China, or was it people who were friends who went to study Chinese, or did studying Chinese turn them into friends? Anyway, maybe both happened. That was a very, very nice. Later on, I actually then got, I married one of the students at PCL later on, and the wedding reception was held in the Bryans' beautiful home in Finchley. It was lovely.
I was going to say, I think you're very right to. We're having trouble.
Hello, I'm sorry to say I can't hear you. You faded away.
You faded away as well. I was just going to say, if you can hear me, that I think Derek Bryan, working from London, if you like, and later on being with Joseph Needham, instrumental in setting up SACU, was terribly important. I mean, he got all of us to work in. I used to teach in the Central London Poly. I didn't feel much that I could do it, but he encouraged me. John Gittings taught there.
John Gittings, yes.
And I think it was just Derek gathering together potential people, and yes. Also he had that view of supporting people. I remember when I came to China as a student, he kept saying, if you'd like to stay on another year, we'd be happy to give you financial support. I mean, they were terrific supporters, he and Hung Ying, of in a sense, British-Chinese connection in that way. They were marvelous. Yeah. And it's nice to hear that you benefit.
I think yes, well, I think that, as you say, I think he very nicely complemented Dr. Needham, who was, I wouldn't say he was an ivory tower or whatever. He did fabulous work, but the networking, I think when I stayed with Derek and Hong Ying, I would, at the dinner table, I'd hear them planning another event. They say, now, who got a SACU event? Oh, Han Su-yin's in town. Shall we, what are we going to do? And so they were such practical people. So self-effacing in a way. It took me years to find out that actually Derek had a fascinating life story of Cambridge eyes, and that he knew Blunt personally. I don't know if you know those interesting Cambridge eye stories. But yes, bringing people together was a particularly wonderful thing that Derek could do, I think. So charming, such a gentleman. In contrast, when I mentioned that I went to, after the Cultural Revolution, and I went to England hoping to go to college. Dad came on a visit, and I guess it's understandable that all parents want nothing but the best for their children. So being an old friend, Dad took me up to Cambridge. We went to the Master's Lodge at Keys for tea with Dr. Needham, and Dad, in a rather, oh dear, embarrassing way, hinted that I should be given a back door to Cambridge. Anyway, but oh, Dr. Needham, he was a charming fellow too. Yeah, but no, I didn't want to, I don't know, I'm not Cambridge stuff probably. I was happy with London.
That's rarefied. Can you tell us a bit more about Gung Ho, the cooperatives, say through, how it transformed in the anti-Japanese war period? It was absolutely crucial in the very kind of remote areas. And how did it do in the 1950s and 60s? Were your parents still involved at that? Were they involved at that time?
No, my parents were fascinated by rural developments and social change, basically. Mum is an anthropologist. Dad was more like he wanted to document. He saw himself as a journalist, but they were both trapped into teaching full time, which was quite a heavy workload. But the thing with Gung Ho is that when all these cooperatives were basically nationalized. So by 1952, the communist rural program was one of collectivization. They used the term cooperativization, but I think there's quite a subtle difference there. Well, quite a significant difference. The principle for a cooperative is, one of the principles is voluntary association. And you're free to join. You're also free to leave. And if you have free association, and I've experienced this in Britain too myself, when I worked in a factory in London where there were workers working on piecework, and they would cover for each other by working in little cooperative groups to ensure, so that if one person fell ill, or the others, and then they couldn't go to work, they might go for weeks without pay. Well, if you get, it's a sort of mutual insurance system where you join this team and they pool their London was a very sad meeting once, because it's a form of cooperative. They got together and discussed, oh, well, Mr. Jones, not his real name, he's really getting slow. And the end result was he was expelled from the group. Now, so cooperatives are voluntary association. Now that's wonderful, but I think at that time, Mao's idea, Liu Shaoqi, who later became president, actually had a draft cooperative law that he wanted to put to the legislature in 1950, but Mao more or less vetoed it. And the idea was, looking back, I think the idea was, we need everyone to be on board. We cannot afford to have this voluntary system because some people are going to be left on the wayside and left hungry. And because what if you have a family where you're sick and feeble and have too many dependents who are not in a position to work and so on. So instead of cooperatives, they instituted a collective system, which meant involuntary association. Everyone was in, like it or not. Now, so when the communes were set up, for example, in 1958, the first ones came about, it was basically everyone in the community had to join and everyone was looked after. And that was, I think that was a typical Mao system, which is the smart ones who would get rich first in a market economy, they might go zipping ahead and become millionaires. Meanwhile, those who had less skills or were disabled or unfortunate or whatever would be left. That wasn't what they wanted. Now later, so some say, you know, now there's people looking at Chinese history say, well, you know, you had it the Mao way, let's say 20 odd years from 1949 to let's 49 to 30 years. Well, the first 30 is much more a collective system. And now, then the reform and opening, they decollectivized the communes. Many of them were broken up.
You've frozen to us. I don't know.
A lot of people got, productivity rose. However, there is also a downside. I think that the gap, the income gap, and they call it the Gini coefficient increases. But I think that looking back, and this is, my parents feel very strongly about this, and so do I, that without the collective, without that base that was built up by collectives, you know, one of the things is with the people are working together, you can dig ditches, build dams, build roads, the rural infrastructure. When you don't have machines. Now China just has machines and big companies move in and so on. But in those days, that was what gave China that necessary infrastructure to build upon. So I'd say China, without the first 30 years, there would not be the next 40 years because it actually built on that collective economy. I think similarly with the industry, that was agriculture. I'm drifting away from this topic of of Brits in China, which was what I'm really passionate about, but I guess I get excited and anyway.
Well, it's my fault a bit. But tell us more a bit about the rest. I mean, your parents wrote 3 books, yes? And didn't Isabel publish one quite recently?
Yes, well, about all the books were about the countryside. They were teachers for most of their lives, but they did help to write textbooks. And Dad actually was involved in one of the best Chinese English dictionaries. Also, he spent some years working on a Chinese English dictionary. But no, that most of their scholarship, I would say, is about rural development. Mum's, I know that some anthropologists or sociologists go off somewhere and visit a place, and I know people in the Chinese Academy of Science Rural Development Institute who will go to a village, stay a few days or a few weeks, and then out comes a book. But the way my mum worked was she would stay months and sometimes years in a community for detailed study. So I find them very fascinating read. Predicament is the name of one book that my mum wrote about, which she lived in this small village for about, I don't know, best part of 2 years, interviewed every last family in the community more than once, and gripping details. And this is one of the things that made my parents so, I think, so happy with the People's Republic, the new China, as they call it, because the period that they covered, there was conscription, there was opium addiction, there was child brides being well, people were, especially women, were sold, could be bought and sold, and the poverty and so on. And a lot of this was due to the economic base, I think. And the land reform was really one thing that my parents wrote in one of their books was they saw a group of new recruits to the army in the late 40s. This is around 48. And they said, what a contrast, because in the early 40s, when the nationalists were conscripting people, the conscripts had to be basically kidnapped from their homes, tied up in ropes. Sometimes they did this really cruel practice of running a wire through the shoulder, through the soft part. Oh, horrible stuff. String them up. You know, they're like convicts, dragging them off to war. And then they compared they said they saw these new, I won't call the conscripts, recruits, volunteers. They were wearing red sort of big flowers, and the parents were bringing gifts and singing and dancing, and they were so cheerful. And the reason for that was China's it's a land of farmers. And if the communists, if you're a landless family that has suddenly been given half an acre of land, well, enough to live on, well, the gratitude, that's, so I think that China, all these years, the level of the approval rating of the government has remained consistently high, despite the lack of of these trammels of well, I don't know, the trappings of electoral democracy. But I'm still talking about China rather than Brits.
Get back to the Brits then. What would you like to say, particularly?
In the people who helped to write, yeah, I think, Francis, you're right. It wasn't just my mother's Canadian, and the English-speaking community here in China. There's lots of Americans and so on. I don't mix, because of language things, I didn't mix much with the French and the Germans and the Japanese and whatnot. But one thing I'll say about the foreigners, the expat community here in the old days, was they were basically a bunch of idealists. They were excited at looking at a social experiment where the intentions were always always wonderful. The outcomes, well, what Mum likes to say is, if you're conducting experiments, you don't expect an experiment to succeed on the first try. So sometimes things go wrong, and they did. There were events in my memory. Well, during the Cultural Revolution, my dad was taken for a spy and locked up for 5 years in solitary confinement. That's no fun. But Mum was also so. But the idea behind some of these movements, launched, I think, mostly under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, were social experiments that were designed to change the old order and bring about a more equitable society. That was certainly the intention. And I think that if you look at the elevation from poverty in recent years, certainly success far more than failure, I would say.
I think it's it's fascinating to think of your father. I mean, yeah. Well, and your mother, but, so long ago, being moved to go to Spain, to fight for what he believed in, and then to go to China. I mean, as you say, idealists, but it's a fantastic history of idealism. And I'd say that Derek Bryan was similar. I mean, once he discovered China, yes, and he explored it in a way that very few diplomats did. I mean, he went on a great hiking tour of the Tibetan foothills with Julian Bell and a young Chinese writer, Ye Junyan. He got to know Chinese people. I mean, he was a very different character from your average diplomat. So it's not surprising that in the end, the Foreign Office kind of got rid of him by saying that he could only serve in Latin America or something. These ideas were terrific.
As I recall, there was the Amethyst incident where a British gunboat was sailing in, several hundred miles up the Yangtze, deep in Chinese territory, and there was a civil war going on in China, and there was some there was some firing from the banks. Now, who started it, who did it, I don't know, but instead of arguing about that, I'd like to ask any Brit if there was some Chinese gunboat up in Twickenham or whatever, up the Thames or up the Humber or up whatever, and during a wartime, would they get all indignant at being caught up in the crossfire? They had no, I was going to use a bad word, they had no business being there whatsoever. And Derek, I think he, in reporting about the Amethyst incident, did not share the indignation of some of the Western powers at what had happened, and I think that he was punished for that. I think he said that they offered him a position in Peru or something. Yeah.
I think the Amethyst is interesting because you're quite right to say. I mean, it was an outrageous incident, but another person involved in that was Sir Edward Yude, who eventually became, frightfully important ambassador to China and so on. And whilst one might assume that he was a dyed-in-the-wool diplomat, who would only support British interests and so on, he and his wife, they met in China, and they were both passionate about China. I mean, they were very constrained by the diplomatic sort of rules. But I mean, I remember being in the Guanghua bookshop, and Sir Edward Yude came in his lunch hour to buy a copy of the Zhi Tongjian, because he was just, China to them was the place they met. So therefore it had sentimental importance, but also intellectually, they were completely in tune with Chinese history. So the Amethyst is quite an interesting pivot.
But the diplomats, Sir Archibald Clark Carr was a great supporter of the gung ho movement, and actually there was another diplomat, Alexander, I think, who was also very keen supporter. I was asked to write a sort of a foreword to a book called Foreigners Who Sojourned in Peking a few years ago, and one thing that I recall was that if I meet Chinese in the street and they say, "Oh, 你是哪儿的人呢? Where do you come from?" and I say British, there was a time when people would say, "Ah, opium, you burned the summer palace," and that sort of thing. And the image of the Brits was that they came to China, you know, destruction or dope peddling and, you know, that sort of thing. But actually, there have been so many good Brits going back quite a while too. I mentioned the social gospel movement. Actually, if you look at China's leading hospitals, I think China's local rating is top PUMC, number 2 West China, Huaxi. These were both, so China's top hospitals, top medical schools, top universities. I think if you say, well, Tsinghua was not really, there was Boxer indemnity money, but Beida, Peking University, actually a lot of it's standing on the campus of the Yenjing University, which was founded by the missionaries. There were lots of good people, people who were teaching at Yenjing, for example. I think of Ralph Lapwood, Ralph and Nancy Lapwood, the Lapwoods, William Band, or Michael Lindsay. A lot of these, these were all Brits who were teaching in China, and they were very, very sympathetic and helped with the wars. And even during the Korean War, when you might think, oh, Britain is, you know, UN was fighting this war against North Korea and China, but the Empsons, they had these little puppets, and we have pictures of that they did little Punch and Judy shows that were so sympathetic with China. I think China, well, I don't know how many, of course, we're probably preaching to the converted now because this is a SACU event, and who would join SACU if they didn't, you know, care for China? But it's such a wonderful place, such wonderful people, such it's addictive.
That's great. I think many SACU members would agree with you that it's addictive. Once you start, you can't stop. I'm conscious that we're getting towards the end. There's only one kind of question in the Q&A, yes, which is a question of whether you'd heard about a missionary called Boshart, who was very much associated with Manchester. He was captured on the Long March, I think. But as far as yes, I know, he was very much a missionary, not a yes, founder of schools or things like that.
I don't know the details, but I think, was he with Xiao Ke, General Xiao Ke? I forget. Yeah, there was an unwilling missionary who was captured, but wrote a rather favorable account. No, I'm afraid I don't know the details, but I know that some of the missionaries were very supportive. One thing that Dad did when he was involved in a mission university, he asked them, is Christianity compatible with communism? He himself thought no, but many of the Christians working in those institutions said, why, yes. And I know that in my mum's Canadian missionary circle in Chengdu, there were 3 leading missionaries who came to be nicknamed the 3 Bolsheviks. Canadian James Endicott, who, for example, there's one of them was British, but I don't want to name the British one because I believe his children are not proud of his connection with communism. Yeah, or should I mention it? I don't know. I should mention that Quakers, for example, some of them, well, Society of Friends, the amount, it's very sad that I think Ruth Baker died last year, and there was a Quaker China group meeting every year for decades. The friendship built there. I actually attended a Quaker school, a Sidcutt school, and two of my schoolmates were Peter and Paul Reynolds, the sons of Anthony Tony Reynolds, who was one of the leaders of the Friends Ambulance Unit. Oh, such wonderful people. Anyway, the Brits should be very proud of the friendship and support that has been given to China over the years, right up to the present, I'd say.
That's I feel that what I would like to do is encourage you to write a book about the Brits and China. I mean, these impressions are so broad, deep, long, and so on. It would be absolutely fantastic. There's one more question.
I'll send you my... Oh, right.
There's one more question in the chat about, did you ever meet Ma Haider, Dr. Ma?
Oh, George
Hatem.
Certainly, absolutely. Yes, George Hatem, man. He died in 19. We used to get summers by the seaside, and one made no tales. He had a floating on his stomach with hands and feet sticking out of the water. And that was something I've never been able to do. And the only other person who could do it was Dr. Hans Müller. But he was a very genial person. When Rui Ali died, he took over briefly as the chair. So in a sense, he was one of my predecessors. Unfortunately, he died a few months later in 1988. Yeah, wonderful man. His wife, Su Fei, is now 102, and her mind is clear. And we like to visit her sometimes. Yes, a wonderful person. George did so much for China, fighting leprosy and so on. Yeah, and venereal disease earlier.
Thank you. I think,
well, I guess we're running
fear
out
the
of
time has, yes, time has caught up with us, but we could go on forever. And as I say, I hope very much that your rich memories and knowledge will be recorded more than just on a meeting like this, but that you'll put things down if you ever have the time. But I guess your time is pretty taken up.
I'd like to thank both Michael and Francis for that fascinating conversation. I could have listened forever. Francis, I think we're going to need a part 2. You're going to have to construct a part 2 for another conversation with Michael. So can I just really close the meeting and say that was really interesting, but you can see it's just the start of some little snippets, as Francis says, and we really need to encourage you to put finger to keyboard, Michael, on some of all this. So I think we'll
stories with pictures.
More stories to come. So thank you both very, very much for that really insightful conversation. And I look forward to hearing more in another session. But for now, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. And I would say we had lots of interesting people who joined the talk. So thank you very much. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.